I spent a long time comparing 4 countries in Southeast Asia before I finally admitted something to myself. The cheapest country was not automatically the best country for me. The country that looked easiest on paper was not automatically the place where I would feel at home. And the things I thought would matter most at the beginning were not the things that made my final decision. The 4 countries on my list were Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Philippines. Cambodia looked like the place where my money might go the farthest. Vietnam seemed to offer incredible value. Thailand looked polished, convenient, and easy to recommend. And the Philippines? Honestly, the Philippines came with a longer list of compromises than I expected. So if I had made my choice with a spreadsheet, I might not be here. But I was not looking for the best place to spend a 2-week vacation. I was looking for a place where I could wake up on an ordinary Tuesday, buy groceries, take care of a problem, talk to somebody, and still feel good about being there after the excitement wore off. That is a very different test. I wanted a comfortable life, but I also wanted an honest one. I was not interested in proving that I could survive on the smallest amount possible. I like air conditioning. I want reliable internet. I want a clean, comfortable place to live. I want to eat out sometimes, take the occasional trip, and use private transportation when the heat or the rain makes that worth paying for. I also wanted enough left over for medical care, emergencies, and a flight home if I ever needed one. Any retirement budget can look impressive if you leave out half the expenses. That was my starting point. Not how cheaply can a person survive, but what would a life I actually enjoy cost? I compared housing, food, transportation, healthcare, communication, and the practical side of staying long term. But I also compared things that are harder to put into a chart. How difficult is it to meet people? How much energy does an ordinary errand take? If I have a problem, can I explain it? If I am still living there years from now, will daily life feel manageable or exhausting? And I learned pretty quickly that every country has people online claiming it is either paradise or a complete disaster. Usually, it is neither. Every place gives you something, and every place asks you to accept something in return. Vietnam gave me tremendous value, but I had questions about communication and pace. Cambodia gave me the lowest possible budget, but I wondered whether saving the most money would make up for the things I might miss. Thailand made the most practical sense, but practical and personal are not always the same thing. The Philippines did not win every category, but it kept winning the categories that became more important the longer I thought about actually living here. So I want to walk you through how I compared them, what I think people often overlook, and why I eventually chose the Philippines, even though another country could have made more sense on paper. This is not a ranking for everybody. I am not going to tell you that one country is perfect and the others are mistakes. I can only tell you what mattered to me and what I would suggest you think about before making a decision this big. Because choosing a country is easy when you are choosing a vacation. Choosing a place to build a normal life is where the real questions begin. Before I compared countries, I had to be honest about the kind of life I wanted. That sounds obvious, but I think this is where a lot of retirement plans start going wrong. It is easy to watch somebody live in a small local apartment, eat every meal from a neighborhood stall, and say he spends almost nothing. Maybe he does. If he is comfortable, that is a great life for him. But that does not mean I would be comfortable living the same way. On the other side, there are people living in luxury condos, eating imported food, taking private cars everywhere, and saying a country has become expensive. That can also be true for the life they chose. The country does not create the entire budget. Your habits create a lot of it. So I made 2 lists. The first list was what I needed. The second was what I simply preferred. I needed a safe and clean place to live. I needed dependable internet, air conditioning, access to medical care, and a realistic way to get around. I needed to be able to handle banking, phone service, immigration requirements, and ordinary paperwork without turning every little problem into a crisis. My preferences were more flexible. I would rather have extra space, but I do not need a huge home. I enjoy familiar food occasionally, but I do not need imported products every day. I like being able to walk places, but I can adjust if transportation is affordable and easy to find. Then I added the expenses people tend to forget. There may still be bills back home. You may want to keep your old phone number. You may need insurance. You may have subscriptions, banking fees, storage, tax preparation, or family obligations. You also need to spread the cost of flights across the year instead of pretending they do not count because you did not buy one this month. And an emergency fund is not monthly income. I see people mix those two together all the time. Savings can protect you when something goes wrong, but if you need to pull money out every month just to maintain your normal life, your budget is not really balanced. For my comparison, I used a comfortable, middle-of-the-road lifestyle. Not luxury, not survival. A furnished home in a decent area. Mostly local groceries, some meals out, air conditioning used sensibly, regular transportation, private health care when needed, and enough flexibility to enjoy life. I also stopped treating the national average as if it described every city. It does not. A capital city, a famous beach area, and a less touristy regional city can have completely different housing costs. The same country can feel affordable or expensive depending on where you land and how you live. That is why I did not try to find one magic number for each country. I looked for a realistic range and then asked a better question. How much margin would I have after paying for the life I want? Margin matters. It is the money that handles a higher electric bill, a dental problem, a broken phone, or a trip you did not plan. Living abroad feels very different when one surprise can wipe out the entire month. But money was only half of it. I also thought about what I call the energy cost of a place. Some countries can be inexpensive financially, but expensive mentally. If every appointment, delivery, repair, and form requires a translation app or help from somebody else, that may be fine when everything still feels new. Years later, it might wear me down. I wanted independence. I wanted to be able to solve most ordinary problems myself. I did not expect another country to work exactly like home, but I needed to know how much daily friction I could honestly accept. Once I understood that, the 4-country comparison became much more useful. I was not looking for the country that won the internet. I was looking for the country whose trade-offs fit me. Vietnam was probably the easiest country to admire for value. Every time I compared basic expenses, it seemed to offer a lot for the money. Housing can vary enormously depending on the city and neighborhood, but I kept finding modern apartments, affordable local meals, inexpensive transportation, and services that made everyday life convenient. If my decision had been based only on what I received for each dollar, Vietnam would have been difficult to beat. I also liked the energy. There is always something happening. Food is everywhere. coffee is part of daily life. A person can build a routine around a morning walk, a simple breakfast, a few errands, and an inexpensive meal without feeling as if every day is draining the budget. That matters because I did not want retirement to feel like sitting inside all day protecting my money. I wanted to participate in the place where I lived. Vietnam also seemed like a good fit for someone who enjoys a faster rhythm. The streets are active, the cities feel alive, and even a basic trip outside can feel interesting. Of course, interesting and relaxing are not always the same thing. Traffic was one of the first things I thought about. Plenty of people adapt to it and stop noticing it. I am sure I could become more comfortable too. But I was not only thinking about my first 6 months. I was trying to picture ordinary life several years later. Would I still enjoy that energy? Or would I eventually start organizing my day around avoiding it? Communication was the larger question for me. Translation apps are useful, and people can be patient and helpful. But simple communication is not the same as being able to explain something complicated. Ordering lunch is one thing. Discussing a medical problem, understanding a contract, resolving a banking issue, or explaining what is wrong with the air conditioner is something else. I did not see that as a criticism of Vietnam. If I move to another country, I am the visitor and adapting is my responsibility. I could learn more of the language, and I would need to. The question was whether I wanted that challenge to be part of nearly every area of my life. For some people, the answer is absolutely yes. Learning the language becomes part of the experience. The pace feels exciting rather than tiring, and the value makes it worthwhile. For me, Vietnam won on value and everyday affordability. It also offered a lifestyle that looked active and engaging, but I had to give it lower marks for the ease of handling more complicated parts of life independently. That became a pattern in my comparison. The things that make a country exciting during the first year can become the things that require the most energy later. I also reminded myself that eating inexpensive local food every day and renting at a long-term local rate are not automatic. A newcomer often pays more. Short-term housing costs more. Familiar food costs more. Choosing the easiest transportation costs more. Making mistakes costs more. I call that the newcomer tax. It is not an official fee. It is just what happens when you do not know which neighborhood to choose, what things should cost, or how to arrange your life efficiently yet. So, if you are considering Vietnam, I would not build your plan around the lowest number you see online. Give yourself room to learn. Think about the language seriously. Think about the city, not just the country. And ask whether the pace gives you energy or takes it away. Vietnam made a strong case. It showed me how comfortable a budget could look. But it also taught me that value is not only about how much you can buy. It is also about how much effort it takes to live the life you are buying. Cambodia was the country that made the financial side look almost too good to ignore. When I compared housing, local food, transportation, and basic services, Cambodia often came out as the lowest cost option. A careful person could potentially create more breathing room there than in the other countries on my list. And breathing room is important. If your monthly income is fixed, spending less can mean more than extra restaurant meals. It can mean a larger medical reserve. It can mean being able to fly home without worrying. It can mean sleeping better because one unexpected expense is not going to destroy your plan. I understood the attraction immediately. Cambodia also looked less polished in a way that some people genuinely enjoy. Life can feel more open and less controlled. There are communities where foreigners have built comfortable routines, met friends, and stayed for years. If someone values simplicity and flexibility, Cambodia may be exactly what he is looking for. But I had to separate what was inexpensive from what was right for me. Healthcare was one concern. Basic care and routine needs are one thing. A serious or complicated condition is another. I had to think about whether I would be comfortable with the options nearby, whether I might travel to another country for certain treatment, and what that would do to the budget I thought I was saving. Infrastructure mattered too. I am flexible, but I know myself. Reliable utilities, convenient shopping, good roads, and easy access to services become more important to me when I am living somewhere, not merely visiting. There is no prize for choosing the country with the lowest rent if I spend the rest of my time working around things that frustrate me. That does not make Cambodia a poor choice. It means the savings have to be weighed against the lifestyle. Another person could look at the same trade-off and make the opposite decision. I also asked how large my world would become there. Would I build a full routine, or would I slowly reduce my life to a few familiar streets, businesses, and people because those were the easiest places to manage? That question stayed with me because affordability can hide isolation. A cheap apartment is not much of a victory if I spend most of my time alone inside it. I think men are especially good at pretending that will not bother us. We tell ourselves we like our own company. We stay busy. We say we do not need much. There is nothing wrong with enjoying solitude, but solitude and isolation are not the same thing. Solitude is something you choose. Isolation can happen so gradually that you do not notice it until your whole week depends on one or two brief conversations. So Cambodia won the cost category for me. It offered the greatest chance to build savings into the monthly budget. But when I looked at healthcare, infrastructure, long-term convenience, and the type of social routine I hoped to build, the answer became less certain. If Cambodia is on your list, I would suggest testing normal life there instead of testing vacation life. Rent a place with the kind of comfort you really need. Buy groceries. Use the internet at the times you normally would. Visit a clinic before you need one. See what transportation feels like when it is raining or when you are tired. And do not spend every day sightseeing. Give yourself a few boring days. Boring days are useful because retirement contains a lot more ordinary Wednesdays than perfect sunsets. Cambodia taught me that the cheapest choice can be a very good choice, but cheap is not a complete plan. The money you save only matters if you also like the life attached to it. Thailand was the country I expected to choose. It seemed to offer the strongest overall package. Good infrastructure, plenty of housing choices, excellent food, established foreign communities, and access to high-quality private healthcare in the larger cities. Compared with the other countries on my list, Thailand looked like the easiest recommendation. There are also enough different types of places that a person can choose the pace he wants. A major city can offer convenience and medical access. A smaller city can provide a slower routine and potentially lower costs. Coastal and island areas offer another lifestyle entirely, although the popular ones can become expensive. That variety made Thailand feel practical. I could picture arriving, setting up a comfortable home, and finding most of what I needed without too much trouble. The food was another major advantage. Eating local food can be affordable, and the variety makes it easier to avoid falling into an expensive, imported food routine. Transportation can be convenient in the right area. Private hospitals and international services can reduce some of the anxiety that comes with moving abroad. On my comparison sheet, Thailand kept collecting points. But then I started asking what my actual days would look like. Would I make local friends? Or would nearly all my relationships stay inside a foreigner bubble? Would I learn enough of the language to move beyond basic transactions? Would I feel connected to the community or simply comfortable inside it? There is nothing wrong with an expat community. Having people nearby who understand the same problems can make the transition much easier. They can help with housing, paperwork, transportation, and all the little surprises that come with a move. But I did not want my whole life abroad to feel like a waiting room filled with other foreigners. Language came into the picture again. It is possible to live comfortably in many parts of Thailand with limited Thai, especially in places used to international visitors. But possible is not the same as connected. I had to decide how much effort I was prepared to put into crossing that gap. If I stayed for years without learning much, would daily life still feel welcoming? Or would I always remain one step outside it? Then there was the practical side of staying legally. Rules, costs, financial requirements, and available options can change. I knew I would need to verify the current requirements instead of trusting an old video or a comment written by somebody whose situation was different from mine. That advice applies to all 4 countries. Never make a move based on immigration information from a video that may be years old. Use official sources and check again before spending money. Thailand did not fall apart under closer examination. It remained an excellent option. In fact, if someone asked me which country looked most balanced for the widest range of people, Thailand might still be my answer. But I was not choosing for the widest range of people. I was choosing for myself. Thailand won on Polish, convenience, and the feeling that a comfortable life could be organized fairly quickly. It also looked strongest for someone who wanted a large, established retirement scene. What it did not automatically give me was the sense that I would become part of ordinary life. Maybe that would have happened with time. Maybe I would have built exactly the community I wanted. But I could not award points for a connection I was only assuming would appear. Thailand was the sensible choice. And for a while, I thought sensible would be enough. The Philippines was more complicated. It was not always the cheapest option. Electricity can surprise people, especially if they run air conditioning the way they did back home. Imported groceries can destroy a budget quickly. Housing prices vary a lot, and short-term rentals can make the country look more expensive than a long-term resident would experience. Transportation also depends heavily on where you live. Some places are easier without a car than others. Traffic, heat, rain, noise, and uneven infrastructure are real parts of daily life. I did not want to erase those things just because I liked the country. Healthcare required the same kind of honest thinking. There is good private care available, particularly in larger cities, but access and quality are not identical everywhere. I needed to think about what was nearby, what insurance would cover, and what I would do if I needed treatment that was not available locally. So no, the Philippines did not win by being perfect. What changed the comparison was how much easier it felt to participate in ordinary life. English is widely used. That does not mean every conversation is effortless, or that I never misunderstand anything. But I can explain what I need at a pharmacy. I can ask a follow-up question at a clinic. I can discuss a rental problem, understand more of the paperwork, and have a conversation that goes beyond pointing at a menu. That gave me something I had underestimated: independence. It also made casual connection easier. I could talk with people in stores, restaurants, elevators, and waiting areas. Not every conversation becomes a friendship, of course. Friendly people do not automatically create a social life for me. I still have to show up, remember names, accept invitations, and make an effort. But the door feels easier to open. That mattered more than I expected, because building a life abroad is mostly repetition. You go to the same grocery store. You find a barber you like. You recognize the security guard. Somebody remembers how you take your coffee. You slowly stop feeling as if every day requires a plan. The Philippines gave me a clearer path from being a visitor to having a routine. I also appreciated the humor. Being able to joke with somebody, understand the response, and share an ordinary moment can make a foreign place feel less foreign. That is difficult to calculate, but it changes the emotional cost of the day. Of course, friendliness can be misunderstood, too. A warm welcome is not proof that every person has good intentions. I still have to use judgment. I do not lend money I cannot afford to lose. I do not rush into business deals, property arrangements, or relationships because somebody makes me feel important. The same common sense I needed back home did not disappear when I got on a plane. That is especially important for men who arrive feeling lonely. Attention can feel like connection when you have not had much of either. They are not always the same thing. A healthy life needs more than one person, one relationship, or one social circle. I wanted friends, routines, interests, and reasons to leave the house that did not depend on romance. The Philippines seemed to give me more opportunities to build that kind of life naturally. When I put the comparison together, Vietnam offered better value in several areas. Cambodia offered the lowest potential cost. Thailand offered the strongest practical package. But the Philippines reduced the amount of effort required for me to communicate, participate, and feel connected. That was the first time I understood why it kept pulling ahead even when it did not win the spreadsheet. If I were giving advice to a friend who was comparing these countries, the first thing I would say is this: do not move anywhere just because you had a great vacation there. Vacation life is designed around highlights. You eat out, visit beautiful places, and let small inconveniences become part of the adventure. Normal life includes laundry, dental appointments, utility bills, internet problems, and days when you do not feel like doing anything. Before signing a long lease or selling everything back home, I would test the boring version. I would stay long enough for the excitement to fade. I would rent the kind of home I could actually afford long term, not the nicest short-term place I could justify as a vacation expense. I would shop where I expected to shop, cook the way I expected to cook, and use transportation the way I would on an average week. I would also keep track of every expense, not because I enjoy turning life into a spreadsheet, but because small conveniences are easy to forget. Delivery fees, private rides, coffee, laundry, imported food, ATM fees, phone data, weekend trips, and air conditioning can add up quietly. Then I would add a newcomer allowance. The first few months usually cost more because I am still learning. I may choose the wrong neighborhood, pay a short-term rate, take more private transportation, or buy familiar products because everything else already feels unfamiliar. My second piece of advice would be to test healthcare before there is an emergency. Find the nearest clinic and hospital. Learn how payment works. Check what your insurance actually covers. Make a plan for prescriptions and records. Do not wait until you are sick to discover that your entire plan depends on information you never verified. The third thing I would test is loneliness. This one is harder because a person can feel fine for the first month. There is plenty to do, and every day brings something new. The real question is what happens when there is nothing special on the calendar. Do you have a routine that gets you around other people? Can you join a group, volunteer, exercise, attend church, take a class, or become a regular somewhere? Are you willing to initiate plans, or are you expecting a community to arrive at your door? Moving abroad can create an opportunity for a new life, but it cannot do all the work for you. I would also keep an exit plan. That does not mean planning to fail. It means protecting myself from feeling trapped. I want enough money for a flight home, temporary housing, and the first stage of starting over if health, family, finances, or happiness change. I would not buy property immediately. I would not combine finances with somebody I barely know. I would not invest in a business simply because I was excited and somebody presented it as an easy opportunity. A good first year abroad should give me more information, not more commitments. Finally, I would review the decision regularly. Exchange rates change. Rent changes. Immigration rules change. Health changes. The country I choose now does not owe me the exact same experience forever. That is why I prefer thinking in chapters instead of permanent decisions. A 6-month or 1-year plan can be serious without pretending I already know how I will feel 10 years from now. The best country is not the one that requires me to defend it online. It is the one where the compromises remain acceptable after I understand them. In the end, I did not choose the Philippines because it was the cheapest. It was not. I did not choose it because everything worked perfectly. It does not. I chose it because when I imagined an ordinary life in each country, this was the place where I could most easily picture myself participating instead of simply observing. Vietnam made me think about value. Cambodia made me think about financial breathing room. Thailand made me think about convenience and long-term comfort. The Philippines made me think about belonging. And belonging is not something a country hands to me at immigration. I still have to build it. I have to leave the house. I have to be interested in people. I have to adjust when things do not work the way I expect. I have to respect that I moved into somebody else's culture, not the other way around. But communication gives me a head start. Everyday friendliness gives me more chances. A familiar routine gives me something solid to build on. I can have a normal conversation while buying groceries. I can ask questions when I do not understand a bill. I can explain a health concern without feeling completely helpless. I can learn how people live here by talking with them, not only by watching from the outside. Those things did not look dramatic on my comparison sheet. Over time, they became some of the most valuable things on it. I still notice the trade-offs. There are hot days when I do not want to go anywhere. There are noisy days. There are trips that take longer than I think they should. There are products I miss, systems I do not understand, and moments when the easiest solution is simply to be patient. Choosing the Philippines did not make those things disappear. It meant I decided they were compromises I could live with. That is really the whole point of this comparison. Every country asked me to give something up. Vietnam asked whether I could adapt to the pace and language. Cambodia asked whether the lower cost would outweigh my concerns about services and long-term convenience. Thailand asked whether comfort would eventually become connection. The Philippines asked whether I could accept some inefficiency in exchange for communication, accessibility, and a more natural social life. My answer will not be everybody's answer. Someone who loves learning languages and wants incredible value may choose Vietnam. Someone focused on keeping expenses low may feel completely at home in Cambodia. Someone who values infrastructure, healthcare access, and a large international community may decide Thailand is the clear winner. I understand all three choices, but I would still choose the Philippines. Not forever. I do not think I need to promise forever to take the next chapter seriously. I only need to know that the life works now, that the budget is honest, and that I still have the freedom to make a different decision later. For now, I have ordinary places I return to. I recognize people, and some of them recognize me. I know where to get the things I need. I know which inconveniences are worth solving and which ones are easier to accept. The days do not feel like a vacation anymore, and that is exactly why the decision feels real. If you are comparing countries for yourself, do not ask only where your money will last the longest. Ask where your patience will last. Ask where your health needs can be managed. Ask where you can remain independent. Ask where you have a realistic chance of building friendships and purpose after the newness wears off. Most of all, ask what you want your ordinary days to feel like. The answer may lead you somewhere completely different from me. That is fine. This is not about finding the country that wins for everybody. It is about understanding yourself well enough to choose the trade-offs you can actually live with. I came into this comparison looking for the smartest financial decision. I ended up making a decision about the kind of life I wanted. And for me, that life made the most sense here in the Philippines.